By the time Clara Whitcomb backed the old Ford pickup through the rusted front gate, half the county seemed to know she had done something foolish. The truck came crawling down the dirt road under a low gray Arkansas sky, its engine coughing, its tailpipe rattling, and behind it bounced a livestock trailer so dented and patched that the neighbors slowed down just to make sure it would not fall apart before it reached the farm. From inside came the wild, uneven sound of 500 ducks, thin white bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, their wings flapping against wire, their bills tapping the sides, their voices rising over the wet fields like a warning. Clara did not drive toward the barn. She did not unload them near the old chicken house, or the broken hog shed, or the narrow pasture beside the peach trees. She drove straight past the machine shed, past the empty fuel tank, past the soybean field that had failed the year before, and stopped at the edge of the lowest 20 acres on the Whitcomb place. Everyone in Polk County knew that field. It lay behind the house like a bruise, flat and black and half-drowned, holding rain long after the rest of the valley had dried. Years ago, Clara's grandfather had grown rice there when the water could still be managed and the ditches still ran clean. Her father had planted soybeans around its edges during better seasons, trying to make every acre pay. But after 3 wet springs, a collapsed culvert, and too many years without money for proper drainage, the field had become a shallow, muddy basin where weeds grew in mats and mosquitoes lifted in clouds at dusk. Most folks called it dead ground. Clara opened the trailer gate anyway. The ducks poured out in a white, ragged wave, slipping on the muddy ramp, flapping into the water, scattering across the flooded rows as if they had been waiting their whole lives for that ruined place. They dipped their heads into the brown water. They kicked through the mud. They moved into the reeds and weeds and broken rice stubble with a restless hunger that made the whole field seem to stir. Across the road, old pickup trucks slowed. A mail carrier eased past without raising the flag on the mailbox. 2 neighbors stood by the fence line with their hands tucked under their arms. One man shook his head before driving on. Another laughed loud enough for Clara to hear it over the ducks. She stood still in her rubber boots, one hand on the open trailer gate. Mud already splashed up her jeans. Her brown hair was tied behind her neck, and her face looked too young for the weight sitting on her shoulders. She had spent the last of her operating money on those ducks, money that could have gone towards seed, repairs, or one more small payment to keep the banker quiet. From the road, it looked like she had taken what little future the farm had left and released it into a swamp. Clara did not turn around. She did not explain herself. She only watched as the ducks spread across the flooded field, their white backs moving through the dirty water like scraps of paper after a storm. Behind her, the laughter faded down the road. Ahead of her, 500 hungry ducks went to work. The Whitcomb farm had once looked like the kind of place a family could build a whole life around. 86 acres of bottomland and gentle rise, a white farmhouse with a sagging porch, a row of peach trees near the lane, and a barn that had held 3 generations of tools, feed sacks, hay hooks, broken promises, and harvest dust. Clara's grandfather had bought the place after coming home from the army. He had dug ditches with a shovel, set fence posts by hand, and marked every low spot on the property in a notebook that smelled of pencil lead and tobacco. Her father had inherited the farm in a different time. By then, the old ways were already being pushed aside by bigger equipment, bigger loans, bigger yields, and bigger risks. He tried to keep up by rotating rice, soybeans, and a few acres of specialty produce when prices turned. Some years he won, some years the weather took back everything he thought he had gained. Then the stroke came. It hit him in the machine shed on a hot August afternoon, while he was trying to coax the old John Deere into starting before another rainstorm rolled through. Clara found him beside the tractor, one hand curled against his chest, his face pale under the grease and sweat. He survived, but he came home different. His right hand trembled, his speech slowed, his eyes still followed the weather through the kitchen window, but his body no longer went where his mind wanted to go. At 24, Clara became the hands of the farm. She had grown up there, But growing up on a farm was not the same as carrying one. Suddenly, the place revealed how many small failures had been held together by her father's patience. The west fence leaned into Johnson grass. The barn roof leaked above the hayloft. The drainage ditch below the rice field had narrowed to a ribbon. The tractor started only when it felt merciful. The banknote, unlike everything else, arrived on time. The neighbors were polite at first. They brought casseroles. They asked about her father. They told her to call if she needed anything. Then spring came, and politeness turned into advice. Some told her to lease the ground before she ruined it. Some told her to sell the low 20 acres to a man from Little Rock who wanted a private duck hunting pond. Some said she should get a job in town and stop pretending a young woman with a sick father and no working drainage could fight math. Others were kinder, but their kindness carried the same message. The farm was too much. The debt was too real. The land had already made its decision. The banker, Mr. Mallory, said it plainly, without ever raising his voice. He sat behind a polished desk in town, with framed photos of cattle shows and ribbon cuttings on the wall behind him, and told Clara that the bank could not continue extending patience where there was no reliable income. He had known her father for years. He respected the Whitcomb name, but respect did not pay notes, and sentimental attachment did not change the value of drowned ground. Clara listened with her hands folded in her lap. Her boots were clean that day because she had wiped them carefully before walking into the bank, but dried mud still showed in the seams. She had brought her father's notebook with her, the oilcloth cover worn soft at the corners. Mr. Mallory glanced at it the way a man might glance at a child's drawing during a business meeting. The offer to sell the 20 acres remained open. The buyer would pay enough to cover the overdue portion of the note and give Clara room to breathe. On paper, it was sensible. To the county, it was obvious. To the bank, it was almost generous. But Clara had spent her childhood hearing her grandfather call that low field the breathing ground. He said water had memory. He said land did not die all at once. It soured, compacted, choked, and waited. He said the lowest acres on a farm were not always the poorest. Sometimes they were the lungs, taking in what the hills shed, holding what the rest of the place would need later. Clara had not understood him when she was a girl walking beside him through knee-high rice, dragonflies skating over the water. She understood him better after the field began to rot. The water was not moving. The weeds were not being grazed. The insects were multiplying. The mud had sealed over in places like pottery. The field had not failed because it was wet. It had failed because everyone had tried to force it to be dry at the wrong time, cheap at the wrong time, and profitable in the same way as land that sat 10 feet higher. So Clara did not sign the sale papers. She came home, sat at the kitchen table beneath a ceiling fan that clicked every third turn, and opened her father's notebook. His handwriting had changed after the stroke, but the older entries were still sharp and careful. Tucked between chemical application dates and grain prices were notes copied from her grandfather: ducks after floodwater, ducks before rice, ducks for snails, weeds, larvae, and soft mud. Beside one line, her father had written that his own father used birds when he had no money for inputs and too much water to fight. The next morning, Clara made 3 phone calls. By the end of the week, she had bought 500 unwanted ducks from a poultry farmer 2 counties over. They were not young ducklings, and they were not a shining commercial flock ready to lay at full strength. They were mixed-age birds, thin from overcrowding, uneven from poor feed, and rough-looking enough that the seller was glad to see them leave. Some were already near laying age. Others needed weeks of good forage and steady care before they would give her anything back. To Clara, they were not a miracle. They were a tool. The town did not see a tool. The town saw a girl going broke in public. The feed store heard about it first because feed stores hear everything before the newspaper does. Men in seed caps leaned against counters and spoke over coffee while Clara loaded cracked corn, oyster shell, and fencing wire into the bed of her pickup. They watched her count cash carefully, watched her choose the cheaper sacks, watched her lift everything herself. Some shook their heads with pity. Others wore the pleased look of people who had predicted failure, and now saw it arriving on schedule. At Millie's diner, where farmers came before sunrise and after spraying, the story got bigger with every cup of coffee. 500 ducks became 600, then 800. The flooded field became a swamp. Clara became a girl who had confused a farm with a petting zoo. Folks said her father would have known better. They said a notebook could not save land. They said ducks might be fine for a backyard, but not for a banknote. By the next Sunday, everyone had an opinion. The county agent came out on a Wednesday afternoon and parked by the mailbox. He was not unkind. He walked the edge of the water with Clara, looked across the low field, and saw what most trained eyes would see: standing water, weed pressure, poor drainage, disease risk, and a farm family without capital. He suggested she document expenses carefully and avoid expanding until she had a clear market. He advised caution in the soft voice people use when they do not want to crush hope too directly. Clara nodded. She could feel what he was thinking. She could feel what everyone was thinking. It came at her from the road, from the diner, from the bank, from the feed store, from the slow-moving pickups that passed her field twice in one afternoon for no reason except curiosity. The county had made up its mind. Clara Whitcomb was too young, too stubborn, and too attached to ghosts. Still, every morning before daylight, she walked down to the flooded 20 acres with 2 buckets, a notebook, and a headlamp strapped over her cap. At first the work looked like chaos. The ducks churned the water into brown ribbons. They slept in uneven clusters. They scattered into weeds. They found holes in the temporary fencing. They left tracks along the levee and feathers in the reeds. Their shelter was nothing more than tin sheets, old pallets, and a patch tarp tied against the wind. Clara came back to the house each morning smelling of mud, wet feathers, and feed dust. But she watched more than she worried. She noticed where the ducks gathered first and where they avoided. She marked the corners where mosquitoes were thickest. She counted how many snails she found on the rice stubble before the ducks reached an area, and how many remained 3 days later. She tested the mud with a piece of rebar, pushing it down through the sealed top layer, feeling for changes in softness. She watched the water around the ditch outlets, saw where it filmed green and where it began to clear. She learned which weeds the ducks stripped to stems and which they ignored. She wrote it all down. The first 2 weeks gave her almost nothing she could sell. A few scattered eggs appeared in grass clumps and under tin, but not enough to matter. The birds were still recovering. Their feathers were dull. Their bodies were light. Some ate hard and slept harder, as if the field had given them room to remember they were alive. By the 4th week, the mosquito clouds had thinned along the western ditch. By the 5th, the water had begun to lose its sour smell near the shelter. The ducks moved with more weight in their bodies and more purpose in their flock. They swept the shallows, tipped forward with their tails in the air, and worked their bills through mud, roots, larvae, and old weed seed. Only after 6 weeks did the eggs begin to come in numbers Clara could count on. Not from all 500 birds, not even close. Some were too young, some were still too weak, and some would never be good layers. But enough hens began laying that Clara could start sorting, washing, recording, and packing eggs with a care that made the kitchen feel like a small packing room before sunrise. She carried the first serious batch to Millie's diner in plain cartons with the date written by hand. Millie bought 3 dozen because she had known Clara since she was small and because pity sometimes looks like business when offered by someone with a good heart. The next week, she bought 6. Then a baker in town asked for more because duck eggs made richer cakes. A church lady wanted 2 dozen for pound cake. A man who sold at the Saturday farmers market asked if Clara could bring cartons to his booth on consignment. Clara did not tell anyone she was saved. She was not saved. Feed still cost money. The bank still wanted payment. The tractor still would not start unless she tapped the starter with a wrench. A raccoon killed 3 ducks one night before she reinforced the fence. A coyote worried the birds at dusk, leaving the whole flock panicked and scattered. 2 dozen ducks came down sick after a cold rain, and Clara spent the night in the old brooder room with heat lamps hanging from baling wire, mixing electrolytes and checking each weak bird with hands that shook from exhaustion. Some mornings, she collected fewer eggs than she needed to fill orders. Some afternoons, she found holes in her fencing and had to wade through thigh-deep mud to bring birds back from the creek bank. Some nights, she sat at the kitchen table with bills spread before her like bad weather on paper. The bank notice came in a white envelope with her name typed across the front. Her father was asleep when she opened it. Rain ticked against the metal porch roof. The kitchen light hummed overhead. Clara read the amount past due 3 times, as if the numbers might soften if she looked at them long enough. They did not. The farm had been short before the ducks, and the ducks had not yet caught up to the weight already pressing down. For the first time since she had opened the trailer gate, Clara let herself wonder whether everyone had been right. Maybe the field was dead. Maybe her grandfather's notes belonged to a different climate, a different market, a different America. Maybe she had taken a memory and mistaken it for a plan. Maybe love for land could become a kind of blindness. Outside, thunder moved over the valley, and the 20 flooded acres disappeared into the dark. Before dawn, she got up anyway. She pulled on damp jeans, stepped into cold boots, and went back out with a bucket in each hand. That was how the season turned, not with a single lucky break, but with Clara returning again and again to the field that everyone else had written off. She fixed the little things because she could not afford the big ones. She dug silt out of a narrow ditch with a shovel. She used scrap boards to slow water where it was cutting too hard. She patched the collapsed culvert enough to make the flow move again. She built nesting boxes out of boards from a fallen corn crib. She traded eggs for old fencing. She hauled feed in the pickup even when the truck needed oil and the tires were nearly bald. And all the while, the ducks kept working. They ate weed seeds before they could spread. They hunted larvae in the shallows. They stirred the sealed mud. They dropped manure across the field in a slow, living pattern no spreader could have matched so cheaply. The 20 acres that had smelled dead in spring began to change by midsummer. The water still stood, but it no longer seemed stagnant. The edges cleared. Frogs returned. The mud under Clara's boots no longer felt like a sealed lid, but like something breathing beneath her. The egg count climbed slowly. At first, Clara sold locally, because that was all she could manage. But she knew from the notebook and from her own arithmetic that 500 ducks, once healthy, would produce far more than 1 diner and 1 bakery could absorb. Before the flock ever reached full strength, she started building outlets the way her grandfather had built ditches, 1 careful channel at a time. She printed plain labels at the library. She borrowed a neighbor's cooler for Saturday markets. She called a small food co-op 40 miles away and offered samples. She drove to Little Rock with 4 dozen eggs packed in straw and a handwritten sheet explaining the farm, the wetland, and the way the ducks were raised. 2 chefs said no before one asked her to come back the next week with more. By late summer, the eggs were moving in 4 directions. Millie's Diner took a steady order. The bakery used them for custards, pound cakes, and holiday batters. The food co-op bought by the case when Clara could deliver. A farm-to-table restaurant in Little Rock began paying a premium for weekly duck eggs with dark orange yolks, and a story customers remembered. Even then, the money was not rich money. It was better than that. It was steady enough to plan around. Clara kept a separate page for every buyer. She tracked dozens sold, delivery miles, cracked eggs, feed costs, bedding, fencing, cartons, and the number of birds laying. When production exceeded fresh demand, she found another outlet through a licensed baker who made pasta and salted yolks for restaurants. Nothing was wasted if she could help it. Every carton had to pull its weight. But just as the farm began to breathe, the sky opened. Late summer rain came hard out of the Gulf and stalled over the county. For 3 days, clouds sat low on the valley. The creek behind the Whitcomb farm rose brown and fast, carrying branches, foam, and pieces of someone's broken dock. The roads washed at the shoulders. Newly planted fall cover on neighboring fields flattened under sheets of water. Soybean rows in low places drowned beneath muddy runoff. Farmers who had laughed at Clara's ducks now stood at their own field edges, watching water take the shape of their losses. The Whitcomb place should have been the first to suffer. The lowest 20 acres always filled before anything else. The neighbors expected the duck field to become a stinking pond, expected birds to scatter or sicken, expected Clara's experiment to end in exactly the kind of public failure they had been predicting all summer. Then Mr. Mallory called. The bank could not wait beyond 30 days. Clara needed to bring in payment and proof that the farm had ongoing income, or foreclosure proceedings would begin. His tone remained professional, but the message landed like a gate slamming shut. 30 days. Outside, rain ran from the barn roof in silver ropes. The old soybean field ponded between the rows. The driveway softened until tire tracks filled with water. Clara hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen, listening to the ducks calling faintly through the rain. If she was wrong, she would lose the farm. If she was right, the whole county was about to see it. The storm pushed every system in the valley to its limit. Straightened ditches filled too fast and sent water tearing across fields. Bare soil moved in brown sheets. Fertilizer washed out. Low pastures soured. The farms that had spent spring trying to force water away all at once found themselves with nowhere for it to go. But the Whitcomb duck field did what Clara had hoped and feared and prayed it would do. It caught the water. The 20 acres spread the flood instead of letting it cut. The repaired side ditches slowed the flow. The weeds the ducks had thinned no longer formed a choking mat that trapped rot against the surface. The mud, softened and opened by months of movement, absorbed and released water more gently than it had in years. The ducks rode out the storm in the shallows and shelters, restless but alive, feeding whenever the rain eased. When the clouds finally broke, neighbors drove past expecting wreckage. They found the field alive. White ducks moved across the water in clean lines. The smell was wet earth, not rot. The banks held where willow stakes Clara had pushed in earlier had begun to root. The water drained slowly through the channels she had cleared by hand. Beyond the flooded ground, the higher acres had not washed as badly as the neighboring fields because the low 20 had taken the force first. And the eggs kept coming. In the middle of a county-wide mess, Clara was still collecting eggs every morning. While other farmers called insurance agents and waited for fields to dry, she filled cartons, made deliveries, and wrote deposits in the same notebook where she recorded water levels. The diner increased its order because supply trucks were delayed and customers were eating whatever was local. The bakery placed a special order after another supplier fell through. The co-op asked for every case she could spare. The Little Rock restaurant added her farm's name to the menu. 30 days after Mr. Mallory's call, Clara walked into the bank wearing the same boots she had worn the first time, though now there was no way to clean all the mud from the seams. She carried 3 things: a payment, a folder of receipts, and her father's notebook. Mr. Mallory looked older than he had in spring. The whole county had taken losses from the storm, and the bank had heard every version of trouble. Clara sat across from him and laid out the numbers one page at a time. Egg sales, standing orders, feed costs, fencing costs, delivery receipts, deposits, a repayment schedule built not on hope, but on cash already moving through the farm. The 20 acres listed as low-value wet ground were producing weekly income from several buyers, not just one sympathetic diner. The duck eggs had paid the overdue amount. For a long moment, Mr. Mallory said nothing. He turned the pages slowly, checking figures, pausing over the restaurant contract, then over the storm notes, where Clara had recorded water depth, drainage timing, egg count, and bird losses. He had expected a desperate girl asking for more time. Instead, he was looking at records good enough to make doubt uncomfortable. The bank did not forgive the debt. Banks rarely do. But it restructured the note. That was enough. Word spread faster than the rainwater had. At first, people did not believe the eggs had done it. Then Millie mentioned how many dozens she was buying. The bakery owner said Clara's duck eggs had become her best ingredient. Someone saw the food co-op truck turn down the Whitcomb lane. Someone else noticed the county agent's truck parked by the flooded field again, this time for nearly 2 hours. The county agent walked the levee with Clara after the storm damage had dried enough to show what had happened. He crouched near the ditch, pressed the soil in his hand, studied the water line on the posts, and looked across the field where the ducks were moving through the shallows, like they owned the place. He saw the pest reduction, he saw the weed control, he saw the nutrient cycle. More than anything, he saw that Clara had not turned a farm into a duck pond. She had turned a failed wet field back into a working system. By fall, people who once slowed down to laugh now slowed down to look carefully. An older farmer from the north side of the county came by with his cap in both hands and asked where she had bought her fencing. A neighbor who had called the field worthless asked how she kept predators out. Another wanted to know whether ducks would work in a flooded corner of his own place. The man who had wanted to buy the 20 acres for hunting drove past twice one morning and did not stop. Clara answered when she could, but she never performed victory for them. She did not stand in the feed store bragging. She did not remind anyone what they had said. She had learned from land, and land never wasted energy on speeches. Her father improved enough to ride with her in the pickup by late October. She drove him down to the field just after sunrise, when mist floated above the water, and the ducks moved in soft white clusters through gold light. The old man sat quietly, his left hand resting on the notebook in his lap. Clara parked by the levee, opened the windows, and let the morning sounds come in. Water tapping against grass, wings fluttering, ducks murmuring, a distant truck on the road, the world beginning again. The 20 acres that had almost been sold became the most reliable part of the farm. Not the cleanest, not the prettiest, not the kind of field that looked good from a banker's photograph. It was muddy, noisy, and alive. The following spring, Clara planted rice again in sections of the wet field, rotating the ducks through with care, using the old notes and her new ones side by side. The ducks still gave her eggs. The field still held water when it needed to, and released it when it could. The bank payments went out on time. The barn roof got patched. The tractor finally got repaired. The Whitcomb name stayed on the mailbox. By winter, the laughter had disappeared from the road. People still talked about Clara Whitcomb, but their voices had changed. They spoke of the girl who saw value in drowned ground, the girl who read what her father and grandfather left behind, the girl who paid the bank with eggs from a field everyone else had called dead. Clara heard some of it, but she did not carry it around. What mattered was simpler: the porch light in the farmhouse, her father's chair by the window, the notebook on the kitchen table, and the low field still breathing under the morning mist. Years later, folks in the county would point out the Whitcomb place while driving that dirt road. They would talk about ducks, eggs, mud, and a young woman too quiet for most people to understand, until the results became impossible to ignore. But Clara knew the truth was older than her. Her grandfather had seen it first. Her father had written it down. She had only been desperate enough, stubborn enough, and patient enough to listen. And every morning, when the sun rose over the 20 muddy acres the town once laughed at, Clara walked the levee with her notebook under one arm, watching the ducks spread across the water like a promise that had finally come due.